Again, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Today we have a very special speaker for our webinar series. But before I pass the baton to Professor William Sutherland, let me just do a bit of housekeeping. So as you know, this webinar is part of the Integrative Conservation webinar series. And this series of webinars is hosted by Integrative Conservation, which is a relatively new conservation journal. We began publishing in December 2022. We have published 6 issues, and in about 3 weeks, we'll be publishing our June issue. So then if you haven't checked yet, please, audience, go to the website and check our papers. If you are an author and you're looking for an outlet to publish your conservation work, we very much welcome different aspects of conservation research, conservation policy, conservation practice. So as our name indicates, we are integrative, interdisciplinary. We welcome ideas from different angles, dealing with the complexity of perspectives involving conservation. We have different formats of papers to accommodate all this diversity. We focus on quality. We are part of the Chinese Academy of Science. We have a very good editorial board, and we focus a lot on the quality of the review. So then we try to be timely, but we don't aim to be too fast because we think that things take time and quality takes time. We aim to reach globally, both in terms of our content and our readership. And we also try to be very accessible. So then we make an effort to overcome language barriers. We publish the title, abstract, the practitioner points, and the plain language summary in different languages, always trying to publish in the local language, whatever the research is relevant to. And we are open access, and until the end of next year, we don't have any publishing APC, any charge for publication. So then we encourage you guys to submit your work. We are publishing special collections. We have now 2 open calls for papers. One is on snow leopard conservation, and another one is on environmental education or nature education, mainly focused on China. And again, we very much welcome proposals. If we have people in the audience who are interested in submitting some proposal for a special collection, a special issue, please talk to us. We very much welcome ideas. So then anyone who wants to find more, you can scan this QR code or just look for Integrated Conservation online. And you can also follow us on X and other platforms. Next month, we will have another distinguished guest. Will be Professor Rodrigo Medellin from the UNAM, the University of Autonomous University of Mexico. And Rodrigo has broad experience working on. He's an expert on bats. He also works a lot on large carnivores, but also he has done a lot of work on the conservation to policy interface and on communicating conservation to broad audiences. So then we will advertise on due time. And then let's go with today's speaker, Professor William Sutherland, or Bill Sutherland. I think he doesn't need much introduction. He's probably one of the top cited, most known, most influential conservation scientists in the world. So then I was just checking Bill's citations and its index before we join online. And Bill, you have over 70,002 citations in Google Scholar and an H index of over 125. So then, yeah, they are very, very overwhelming numbers. Bill has done. Bill is a professor at the University of Cambridge. He has been the president of the British Ecological Society, and he has been very influential in different aspects of conservation science. I would say the most remarkable one for me, and this is very subjective, is the bringing conservation, evidence-based conservation, or evidence-based approaches into conservation, which I think has played a big role in upgrading how we do conservation, how we think about conservation. And I think that's something that you will talk about today. But also, Bill has been very influential in doing many other kind of approaches, things like doing the horizon scans that he publishes every year in Tree, and they are they are really, really useful exercises to think about, things to come. And every year, I think many of us are waiting for it to be published to see what new things could be coming in the near future. Things like the top 100 questions in ecology and conservation, in agriculture, different ways to synthesize those things. Sorry, we have someone in the audience. Can we mute the audience? And I would say, Bill, I remember when I was a student, and two of the books that I used a lot one was the Ecological Census Techniques, which I think is a simple, very clear, very useful book. And I noticed it's your most cited work. I'm sure it's not the most intellectually challenging, but it was extremely useful, and it was a companion for me for a long time. And you're from individuals to population ecology, that if I can confess, I didn't buy it. I photocopied, and I had a photocopied version for many years. But I was preparing the webinar. I was remembering photocopying it, more than 25 years ago. So then, a big presence for anyone who has been developing in the area of conservation and ecology. I assume you come from bird ecology based on many of your papers and your profiles. So then, thank you for being with us today. Bill's title is going to be "How Can We Transform Conservation to Make It More Effective?" So then I will stop sharing my screen, and Bill, the floor is yours. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Hunter. That was an exceedingly kind introduction, and it's wonderful to see you again after so many years. And your Integrative Conservation Journal, I think, is really interesting. I've just tweeted or X'd about it to enthuse about it. I'm delighted to be here. This seems a really interesting series of talks. Having Rodrigo next month, he's a star. So it does seem a great series of talks, and I'm delighted to be part of that. So let's go to my slides. And I assume you can hear me.
All good. We can see the slides. We can see you. We can hear you. All good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So as you just heard, I'm interested in. So it's wonderful to do science, and thank you for all those amazing statistics I didn't really know about. But what I'm really interested is in making a difference. How can we improve conservation on the ground? And that's what I'd like to talk about. I also, if you've got access to YouTube, here's my latest plaything. I think the future, I was delighted to hear how those books were influential, but people don't really look at books any longer. So I started a YouTube channel to build Sutherland's conservation concepts, to try to explain how scientific concepts and why they're interesting and useful. So I think that may well be the modern way of looking at these things. And it'd be interesting to think whether or not we can produce a Chinese version of that too. Last time I didn't seem to like the first slide. Let's have, come on.
Maybe there is some delay.
I'm going to go on the second slide. Hope I don't have to do this for every slide. So I'd like to start off talking about some experiences from other fields. So this is the Flying Fortress, the B-52, huge American aircraft. And when this was first flown, it's a huge plane, it's a complicated plane. When it was first flown, tragically, it crashed and the test pilot was killed, and they decided that it probably just wasn't flyable, and Boeing almost went bankrupt as a result of this disaster. But then a group of pilots got together and said, yeah, this is really complicated, but we think that if we could write down a list of all the things that you need to do, and then when you fly the plane, you just work your way through that checklist. We think that it's possible to fly it. So they created that checklist, and they found that they could fly this plane, and it became a huge commercial success, very influential. The second thing that happened was that, and you can see this here, was that very often, well, not very often, but regularly, this plane would come in to land, and then just as it was about to land, and the plane was working fine, and the pilot was working fine, the pilot would then crash it. So it would then crash like this on the ground, and you can see it's wouldn't result in deaths, but it's obviously a serious problem. And so they employed this psychologist, Alfonso Chapanis, and said, why are the pilots doing this? And he worked out that there were two knobs on the plane, one of which was to change the flaps, and one of which was to bring the wheels down. So as they're just about to land, and these were in a similar place and looked quite similar, as they're about to land, you should put your wheels down, you put the flaps down, and you crash. So as a result of this, they then changed it. In fact, by law, you have to have little symbols on each of these. And this creation of checklists, so here's the miracle on the Hudson. I'm sure you know about this plane that crashed on the Hudson. And if you read the description, you see that they were looking at checklists. They looked at checklists before they flew. When they hit the birds, the co-pilot, Jeff Stiles, just started working through the checklists. And this is a slightly different example of a checklist. Here's a medical checklist, which has also been influential. And this is for surgery. And they've done experiments to see what happens if you make the surgeons do this checklist beforehand. And the consequence is that there's 17% fewer complications. So it's a huge advance. But if you look at it, it's things like, have you got the right patient? Do you know what the surgery is for? Have you made sure you've got sufficient blood if there's necessary? Have you checked which side they're going to operate on, et cetera, et cetera. So as a result, largely of these two measures of using checklists and changing practices as a result of the lessons from accidents or near accidents, they've massively reduced the number of accidents, which is the top graph on the left, and the number of fatalities, the one on the bottom, and yet the number of flights has gone up hugely. So planes used to be quite dangerous things. They're now exceedingly safe things because of this. Similarly, in engineering and in architectural design, in many areas, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in China too, there are regulations for building. And so if you have an architectural plan like this, you see there's lots of detail, and that detail, a lot of that is to fit in with the regulations, the building regulations that are imposed on builders. And those building regulations are evidence-based, so that a group get together and look at the research and work out what needs to be done. So the builder is building something using evidence, but has no idea that there's evidence involved. And then for my third example, this is James Lind, who was the surgeon on the HM Salisbury. And here's an oil painting of him doing the first ever randomized replicated controlled experiment in medicine. And he was dealing with patients who and trying to work out what ways of solving them. And he had a set of different treatments. So they gave each a quart of cider, teaspoon of vinegar, gave them elixir vinegar, which is sulfuric acid, or seawater, or oranges and lemons, and nutmeg. So these are all suggested treatments for getting rid of scurvy. And so he had patients that had scurvy, picked them so they were identical as possible, and gave pairs of them one of these different treatments to see what would happen. And all of them got worse, apart from the people that were given oranges and lemons, and they got so much better they could help with the experiment and give the others their sulfuric acid, etc. Having invented randomized replicated controlled experiments, Lind then went on to create the systematic review. He brought together all of the information on scurvy together in this report, right? A snappy title, A Treatise on the Scurvy in 3 parts, containing an inquiry into the nature, causes, and cure of that disease, together with a critical and chronological view of what has been published on the subject. So in this, he said he wasn't interested in opinions. He was only interested in what people had observed. So he brought that together. So the first suggestion of using oranges and lemons was in 1593. James Lancaster tried using citrus and showed that people were free of scurvy. James Lind did the randomized replicated controlled experiment I've just discussed. He then did his review. And then 50 years later, the British Navy started introducing oranges and lemons to be taken by the Navy. And then the Merchant Navy did that 50 years later. And in the time, those 2 centuries, it was estimated that 1 million people died in the British Navy due to scurvy. So there's a couple of really big lessons here. One lesson is that if you carry out randomized controlled experiments, you really learn about what's happening. Also, if you pull together the evidence in a neutral way, you really learn what's happening. But the other one is that even though there's the evidence available as what to do, it can take a remarkable amount of time before anyone starts doing anything about it. So, it's 100 years or something before we have the results and the Merchant Navy took action. So what does medicine do? Medicine encourages practitioners to look at the evidence, and it does that, but particularly it provides guidance. So here's some tables for managing for COVID, and it suggests what happens if you've got early COVID or reasonable COVID with pneumonia, or you've got serious COVID, what drugs are best recommended under what conditions. So here, experts have reviewed the literature and made it available so that practitioners can use it. And this has radically improved the effectiveness of medicine. So do we have a problem in conservation? And this is just one example. If you look at mangrove restoration, there are lots of examples of mangroves being planted and it not really working terribly effectively. So I've just produced a book, Transforming Conservation. And in that, I looked at some of the examples which shows the likely gain from using evidence. So just as one example, there's an experimental test in which they had a hospital that worked in a conventional way. It had people who had lots of experience and training and were carrying out medical procedures as usual. And then they had another wing which did the same, but routinely looked at the evidence before carrying out actions. And there was a 19% reduction in fatalities from that, and a big reduction in how long people stayed in hospital. So that shows that using evidence really works. But here, there's a whole set of different examples showing that often there's great variation. Things sometimes work, things don't. very often that there are experiments, such as the experiment on raptors, showing that if you just did the effective measures, you could achieve the same outcomes for 22% less expenditure. Or ideally, you could just do 25%, 20% more and do other things. So there are lots of studies saying that there seem to be problems in conservation. But that's only part of it. There's also, we consider a number of other problems. Practitioners tend not to start off by considering the full range of options, but just look at a handful. Judgments are usually made in a way that extensive research shows are likely to produce the wrong answer. Decision-making rarely follows processes known to be effective. People normally just say, oh, I think that's a good idea. There are more rigid ways of doing that. Costs are rarely presented in a way that makes them comparable, so easy to use. Other sources of knowledge are typically used in a haphazard way, and there's little learning for failing, and there's rarely any effective learning from carrying out the conservation practice. So my view is that there's substantial problems in the way in which you make conservation decisions, and there's a number of stages in which we could do that much more effectively. Just as one example, there's we talked about guidance, and I showed the example from medicine where there was guidance for treatments for COVID. We did an analysis of the 200 bits of guidance for conservation that's produced in the United Kingdom, and we showed that it was very weak. We showed that it wasn't at all clear that it was based on evidence. Most of them didn't quote any evidence. When they did quote the evidence, they didn't link particular statements to particular pieces of evidence. And very often they say, you must do this, and you don't actually know where that piece of information comes from. And just as an example, this is some guidance that's produced on how to grow mistletoe. And this is from probably our most influential gardening organization. But if you look at the statements they make, almost all of them are contradicted by the evidence. So firstly, make sure you choose a tree that's similar to the type of tree in your own garden you wish to establish the mistletoe on. There's no evidence for host specificity in mistletoe. Throw away any that you have at Christmas. Well, they may well be mature, immature, and just discard any crushed berries. You know, are they definite failures? Is it not worth trying them at all? There's no evidence that that's the case. Choose a mature branch. Actually, it seems to be that they prefer younger branches. And then find a natural crevice or make a cut and then put the seeds in there and cover them with hessian. It turns out that mistletoe is really light sensitive. And so if you put it in a crack, if you put it under hessian, it's just not going to survive. So we have this guidance that's been produced, but it's not based on evidence. So our approach is to collate the evidence and make this widely available. And we do this through a couple of sources, one of which is the website Conservation Evidence. We read 1.6 million paper titles in 17 languages, and we pulled this together, and it gives you the evidence for 3,600 different actions. So, for example, you're interested in marine, here are 295 actions, and for each of these are some of the things you could do, and it tells you its effectiveness. We also have a database called Metadata Set, which has 17,000 effect sizes. And I'd like to, because it's less well known, I'd like to just briefly talk about this. And so this means you can do your own analysis. And this is the way we see the future of evidence use. So we're interested in Spartina, which, as many of you probably know, it's an invasive grass that can be a serious problem on coastal habitats. And last year, China decided that it was going to eradicate Spartina, get rid of it by 90%, and the president asked every state to provide a plan within the next 2 months. So we went to this metadata set and pulled out the evidence. So first thing you could do is you could say, well, let's look at the different broad techniques. You can have, so naught shows no change. To the right of naught shows that the Spartina increases. To the left shows it decreases. So normally, not surprisingly, if you try to control Spartina, normally it works, but not always. And you can see that biological control and habitat management are not terribly effective. Chemical measures are quite effective. Integrative techniques seem to be, where you use measures together, seem to be perhaps the most effective. Or you can then go into further detail. So for example, if you do look at herbicides, you can look at the range of different herbicides and what the evidence is that each one is effective. And then with this data set, you can then click to see where all these points come from and understand what this data means. And then also you can say, well, what's the consequence for the native animals that live in the mud if you carry out different sorts of interventions? So the graph on the left shows a range of different techniques: uprooting, plowing, herbicide, flooding, etc., on the change in abundance. So again, if it's to the right, it means that the animals become more abundant, often because you've got rid of the Spartina, so there's more habitat, and shows that some, like burning, have a negative effect. But also, because the way metadata is set up, you can decide that you just want to do the analysis for the Chinese data. And this is what it shows on the right. So the strength of this approach is that you can do the analysis you want to do. You can say, what are the factors you want to compare? What's the outcome measure you want to look at? Do you want to look at native plants, native animals, the amount of Spartina, the soil carbon, whatever it is you want to look at, and there's some data.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for waiting.
So the idea is that people can do their own analysis of whatever they want. And so we then produce this review, what we call an ultra-fast review. We actually did the main analysis in the afternoon, but we then got together, looked at some case studies, looked at some experienced practitioners, and 3 weeks after the announcement was made, we produced this, what we call an ultra-fast review. And that seems to me the way in which we want to be working. We want to have the evidence sitting there so that you can look at it in minutes or hours rather than months. And then Science, the big global scientific journal, wrote about this. They wrote about the program, and they wrote about our work and the review. So we then just produced guidance. And for us, the way in which we want to be working is to produce evidence-based guidance so that you know where the information comes from, you know what the science is underpinning the different statements. And this is or will be available in Chinese. I think it is. I think there's a Chinese version available already. And so what this does is it collates, we call this collected guidance, and there's a set of guidance on a whole set of different interventions, and these are all together. And this just shows one on one action of guidance, showing how to restore mudflats. Okay, so you have this information available. What we now want to do is, what do you do if you've got this information? How do you use it? And our thinking is that the sensible way forward is to weigh the evidence, is to think, how much do you trust the different bits of evidence. And we view this as a cube. So you can say, well, what's the weight of the cube of evidence? And there are three axes. On the bottom is how good is the information? Is it a well-designed experiment or a poorly designed experiment? Is it a good observation, perhaps with a video or DNA or something, or is it some thing you don't trust? And then going up on the y-axis is, do you trust the source? Is it something independent and respectable, or is it something dodgy or something that's likely to be biased? And then the third axis, the z-axis, is how relevant is it to your particular case? So the Spartina examples, if you're interested in China, you're probably more interested in studies in China than you are in studies in America, particularly if you're looking at consequences for biodiversity or something. And then one of the things we're interested in is what's the accuracy of different experimental designs. And this is work very much led and done by Alec Christie, shown at the bottom here. And you can view a range of different experiments. So you can have, this shows some fields with birds in it, and it shows 3 years before and 3 years afterwards, and a number of different fields. So you can have an after experiment where you just say, you set up your fields, you've done your thing, and you see, as a result of it being a protected area or whatever it is, how has the number of birds, say, changed over time? Or you could have a before and after experiment where you compare how many there were before with how many afterwards. Or then in the middle, you can have a control versus impact. So sites where you do it and sites where you don't. Or you can combine these. You can have a before and after control impact, the Bakke design. And then you could randomize these. You can have a randomized controlled impact or a randomized before after controlled impact. So these are just different experimental designs. But the thing that Alex shows is that these results really matter. And this is a slightly complicated graph, but so if you have an after experiment at the bottom, then that's accurate to about 16% of occasions. So 84% of occasions, it's not accurate to within 50%. If you have a controlled impact or before and after, that's better. There's a sort of 30 or 40% chance. And then if you have a randomized control trial, the yellow, or the before-after controlled intervention, you see these are much more accurate. And at the bottom, it shows the number of replicates. And what this shows is if you have a weak experimental design, like an after experiment, if you do lots of them, if you replicate them, you actually gain very little because their accuracy is so low. If you have a well-designed experiment, a randomized control trial, or a Bakke, then doing a number of replicating improves your accuracy. So the key message from this is that the detail of the experimental design really matters as to whether or not you're going to get the right answer. And the commonest experimental design in conservation and in social science is the after experiment. And this shows that the after experiment is actually pretty flawed. So one of the things we do is we produce what we call ziggurat plots, where we take the cube I've shown you with axes from 1 to 5, and then you multiply those together. This is the weight of that plot. And then we put these together. So they form a little tower, rather like a ziggurat, a stepped building. So the one on the left, large negative, there's one study that's quite good, showing it's negative, and there's another one that's pretty weak design. Whereas if you look at the small positive, there's 6 or 8 different studies. So this is a way of showing what the evidence looks like. And this just shows the organizational structures use their funding to invest in organizational development. We've looked at the evidence for this from the MARVA project, one of the biggest funders in Europe. And you can pull together different sorts of studies and analyze them together to show what these results mean. And then what we're interested in is how do you then take that evidence and put that in decision-making tools? And we've done this for a whole range of decision-making tools. And I'm just going to show you one here. This is a mind map. A mind map is just a way of expressing different ideas. So imagine we're interested in conserving this bird, the snipe. Well, there are 4 main things you can do. You can improve the food, you can improve the nest sites, you can stop them being trampled by cattle and sheep, you can reduce the chance of the eggs or the chicks being taken by predators. So let's look at the food on the top left. What can you do? You can provide aquatic invertebrates, which is one of the things they feed on, so you can create pools, or you could create more soil invertebrates. And it turns out that if you flood them, that kills them, but you need penetrability in order for the snipe to insert its beak. And for that, you need to keep it damp, and creating rills, which are these shallow, long ditches, is an effective way of doing that. So this just shows the types of ideas. And then we put the evidence in this by showing pluses for showing something works well and negatives to show something is detrimental. And the number of books between 1 and 5 shows the strength of the evidence. So this is an evidence-based mind map. And then in the Transforming Conservation book, we've done the same approach to insert evidence into a whole range of decision-making tools. Argument maps, multi-criteria analysis, theories of change. All of those, you can embed the evidence in the decision-making process. And we think that's really important. And then people talk a lot about costs because we want to know if something is cost effective. And we've done a review with Tom White of costs in conservation. And almost always the costs aren't recorded. But when the costs are recorded, people just say, this is how much this cost me. And that isn't what you want to know. You don't want to know how much it costs me. You want to know how much it's going to cost you to do it. And so you want to know, when I gave my estimate of the cost, did I include overheads? Did I include the equipment that you have to have? Do I include the cost of labor, and what cost do I include, and so on? Because you will have different costs. You may be using volunteers, or you might be using expensive consultants, and you might have the vehicles that are needed, or you might not. So we suggest that instead of giving the cost, which doesn't tell you anything, you say these are the things that you need. This is the amount of labor that it takes to carry out this project. This is the equipment that you need. This is the consumables you require, the herbicide or the fuel that you need. And if you provide that information, then somebody else can then take that, estimate what resources they would need to do the same, and then work out what it would cost them. And then, sort of wrapping this up, if you've got a conservation project, we think there are 2 stages. We think it's important to reflect on the evidence when you're deciding what to do. But also we think that organizations should find ways of embedding tests into their practice. So our suggestion is that organizations typically think about setting up one experiment a year. And in most cases, they're not very suitable for setting up experiments. You want to find out the odd occasions when this is an easy thing to do. And we think there are three criteria. Firstly, you need to say, what are the results? What are the questions that are answered? What do you actually need to know in order to improve the management? Secondly, do you have the skills that are needed, the identification skills or the skills for setting up the experiment? Thirdly, can you adjust the management plan so you can carry out an experiment? And if that's all the case, then design the experiment. And these experiments can be very simple. If you're dealing with an invasive plant, the sort of as we've just discussed with Spartina, then you can just say, well, let's look at 20 clumps and let's treat a random half of them one way and a random half of them in a different way and look at the consequences of that. So experiments can be very simple, but we could learn a lot from carrying them out. So really, the change we need to make is a cultural change so that it becomes unthinkable for conservation practitioners not to reflect on the evidence when they're making decisions. So in our Transforming Conservation book, we produced a whole series of checklists based on that other work showing how important checklists are. So here are the 8 things that decision makers could do today. So if you're a leading decision maker, you might want to decide whether or not you want to do these. So you can make sure that job adverts specify the need for understanding evidence-based practice. You could make sure there's someone in your organization responsible for creating a strategy for evidence use. You can ensure that there's a means of providing training on the principles, and we're very keen to think more about that. You could state that reporting on evidence use is just a routine part of creating plans and reports. You could have it so that if you ask external bodies, that they have to include a statement on how they use evidence. You can make sure that the standard question, does your manager routinely ask about the underlying evidence, is included in annual views of practitioners and decision-making. You can include a process so that application for funds include reflections on the underlying evidence. And you could make sure that someone's responsible for ensuring that a test of an action's regularly initiated, at least annually, and those results are disseminated. And as you say at the bottom, the Transforming Conservation book has these and other checklists that people can download and use. So this is how we see transforming the world. There's a set of problems that some conservation organizations aren't really delivering. The guidance is old. Agri-environment schemes can be ineffective. Protected areas aren't necessarily effective unless managed properly. Consultants often use out-of-date, unsatisfactory informations. Processes in decision-making are often unsatisfactory. So the challenges could be that auditors might question ineffective government spending as they've done, or funders might start saying we want things to be better, or businesses might want actions to be effective, or people in general might think that there's an evidence crisis, or the increasing expectation for evidence might trickle down to agencies, or planning decisions might be questioned when the evidence is questioned. So to deliver on that, we need these enablers. We need the evidence reasonably complete and accessible, as I've discussed with conservation evidence, metadata set. We need tools available to enable practice, which is why we're producing this Transforming Conservation book. We need processes to encourage evidence use by the community, which is what we're very much working on at the moment. and processes to ease the embedding of tests into practice. And that's the next thing we're very much working on. How do we make it really easy to devise experiments? So if that happens, we expect practitioners to routinely reflect on evidence. We expect government agencies to demand evidence use. We expect we would have routine testing of actions, so the evidence base would increase. We'd have funders routinely asking applicants why their proposals would work. Businesses wanting to know what the evidence is. Consultants having to be evidence-based in order to practice. And if that happens, the consequences becomes unthinkable not to reflect on the evidence. Evidence is embedded into policy and practice. Conservation becomes more attractive to fund. There's more and greater conservation because it's attractive to fund. And there's a massively improved environment as it's better funded and there's more effective practice. So I'd just like to end up on a positive note with a couple of examples. Here's a protest that was being shown. There's this placard. What do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review, which is great. I noticed there's only one placard saying that. And then my daughters have finished university, so this is an old picture. Anna Sutherland, age 10, school report for science. Anna's progressing well, but must take a more evidence-based approach. It's a bit of a damnation on me as a father, but this shows that the demand for evidence is becoming routine. You know, schools are asking it of 10-year-olds. So the wave towards using evidence is happening, and conservation just has to be part of that. And another couple of examples. The weekend, I often do conservation work in the river. There's lots of people at the bottom that really care. And then high up, the person in the pink jacket is called, in the pink shirt is called Michael Gove, is famous, somewhat controversial, but well-known politician. And remarkably, I was with him releasing a beaver. I never thought I'd say that. But he was keen to keep his dowry. There is an interest in some political sectors in order to can think about environmental issues. And certainly rivers, for example, are really high up the political agenda in the United Kingdom. So there's a public will and some political interest to make a difference. And then finally, if you want to learn more, have a look at our Transforming Conservation book, and it's open access. So you can download a copy here. So thanks very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. This has been a very, very good presentation and very, very important and useful for conservation. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Okay, so just to let you know, we had around 1,900 people kind of connecting online through a platform called CoShare. We don't know how many people are behind. People can log in, log out. And we have right now around 50 people on Zoom. So then now what we'll do is we'll pass to the Q&A. So people online, you can type your questions in the chat box, and we will read the questions to Bill as we progress with the discussion. So I will start with a few questions. Yeah, just let you know that I haven't read Transforming Conservation, so I just downloaded the book as you were talking, and it reminds me many of your papers. You know, I think it was paper in 2004, and on evidence-based conservation and the sources that the managers use to make decisions. It might be frozen.
What about this frozen?
I was frozen for a while. Yeah. I think it was frozen. Yes, I remember that I think the decision makers were using most of the decisions based on common sense, based on the personal experience, and the numbers using any kind of evidence-based source. The primary literature things were really tiny. We're talking about the one-digit numbers, right? That was around 20 years ago. So then, do you think this has changed in the last 20 years?
So if you speak to a practitioner and say, why do you do this? Almost always the examples are unsatisfactory. So almost always, I'd say that the field has not moved. But that there are examples of good practice. So bat conservation, we have organizations which we call evidence champions that are taking evidence very seriously. So bat conservation is one good example that has taken it seriously and transformed themselves so they're evidence-based. And there's a whole range of different organizations. So some of them are doing it, but the majority the same as they were when we did that paper 20 years ago. And the same as conservationists were in the 1970s before the evidence revolution.
Yep. And I will add that your data was for the UK, and probably we expect practitioners in the UK to be more familiar with scientific approaches, evidence-based. You were talking about some evidence-based cases from the 16th century. So then, if you go to some of the most biodiversity-rich countries in the world, many countries in tropical Asia, in tropical Africa. Sorry, I'm hearing some echo. And now, I'm not sure why. So then, I expect even lower numbers of people going to any kind of evidence-based source to make decisions. So, in that sense, I guess capacity building and scientific literacy is one of the most important things to be an activist for. I think it's one of the things that we need to push for very, very strongly.
I think that's really important.
Yep.
I think that's really important, and that's partly why I've set up this YouTube to sort of build up the evidence, the understanding of evidence. But including the capacity in finding ways of that is absolutely critical, and we need to find ways of doing that. I think there's another issue, and that is over the language. And Tatsuya Amano, who I think may well be online here, has done fabulous work. So showing that 35% of the literature on biodiversity is not in English. But you look at the big scientific reports and try to find papers that are not in English in that, and almost all of them are. So that chunk of the literature is just missed. And if you and he's plotted it out, and for about half the world, the literature is not in English. So there's this band going from South America to much of Africa to Southern and Eastern Europe, then across Asia, missing out India, but going to China and Indonesia. There's that band, which is half the world, where the literature tends not to be in English. But people, we've found ways of including that, but that's absolutely critical, I think.
Yeah. I was very impressed that you include 17 languages in your database for evidence cases. And also, I was very impressed to hear that you're doing a YouTube channel. I just checked the channel when you were speaking. So the number of people following is much smaller than the number of citations, but I guess it will grow exponentially. It's a different medium. It's a whole different game, right? Being able to produce content that is meaningful, that is useful, but at the same time, it works in that format. So are you doing yourself the kind of the design or the script and the planning of the videos, or you have someone helping you to do that?
No, I do the whole thing, and it's actually quite hard work, because what I try to do is take a concept like extinction debt or mesopredator release or something like that, and then in 2 minutes give an example from the real world. I tend to film those outside and say, this is what you can see here, and explain that concept and explain what it means. So you've really got to do it quite efficiently. But I enjoy it, and I learn quite a lot. And people I put them on Twitter and lots of people seem to like that. And then the build-up of the YouTube channel. And the way I hope it would work is it would just be a resource, rather like a textbook, a sort of modern textbook, which would say,
Sure.
you know, here are 100 concepts, and here's a short description of each. So you can lazily do that rather than having to read anything.
Yeah. I am very much looking forward to these resources to be more popular and more available. And I encourage you to think about doing the same in Bilibili. Is the same kind of platform in China, because the scale of the audience is huge. You know, you can get millions and millions of people viewing these videos. So
let's chat
something else that I'm happy to discuss.
It could be an integrated conservation project that we do jointly or something. Yeah,
definitely. I will be very happy to work on that. And then it was very kind of a bit depressing to see that the after experiments are so ineffective, because in conservation that's what we normally do, right? And experimental design is fine for some conservation interventions, but many of them that had to do with issues about markets, about human behavior, about things that are very much out of your control. You cannot really experiment. So then it makes the high quality evidence, or gathering this high quality evidence, much more difficult. So then how do you see working on this social science interface?
So I think economists are very good at this. So if you just say, I'm going to go and study this, almost always it's sort of impossible. But you could look to say, what's a measure that might be carried out? What's a measure that you could find some way that it might be tested in some regions rather than others? Or for example, in Britain, we have sometimes different policies in England and Wales and Scotland. You could then imagine matching farms along the English and Welsh border, where there's one measure on one set of farms and different measure on another, and matching those up. So those sorts of clever techniques, which economists are really good at, I don't think we really have thought about how do you do that? How do you look at how you could carry out those social interventions in an experimental way? And it is depressing, but that's it's useful to know that if you do the standard after experiment, your results are very likely to be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I guess countries or regions that are a bit more fragmented politically, you know, like federal countries like India or Malaysia or Australia, they can afford to really allow different policies in different states, and then but the point is to make sure that there is a follow-up on the effectiveness, which sometimes the same kind of policymakers or the politicians, maybe they're not so keen on finding out what works and what doesn't work. So that's a bit of a challenge. So
indeed, but it is difficult. But do you want to know whether or not your drugs work? You know, your doctors confidently said you've got these drugs, and it's a bit undermining if it turns out those drugs don't work. But we really, really want to find out whether or not those work, and we do routinely in medicine say we used to recommend this, but we're going to change our mind, and that no longer works. We'll do something differently. And why can't we do the same in conservation? Okay, we were doing that. That doesn't work very well. Let's do something else.
No, conceptually, it's very clear, and I think the people will always buy in when listening the rationale, but the application is very challenging. I think what you were presenting about the scurvy, it's still these days is happening everywhere. You know, we know things when we work on the ground, particularly in I have experience in Southeast Asia. The decisions being made and the practice being applied, we know it doesn't work, and maybe it has been known for 20, 30 years, but there's such a gap between what people know on books and those who are in an office making decisions do. And that gap is getting narrower. And I think Southeast Asia is a good example of how that has improved very fast in the last 20 years, has been really impressive. But still, you get this change at a kind of younger age, at universities, NGOs, but going up into the government and those agents that really make things, that do things, it takes much longer. And I think that's also something that we need to think. It's important to engage these people into science. So then getting students from government that they're not going to become scientists, but if they can learn science and then bring back that knowledge to their job, that's a huge impact in the long term.
Absolutely. Absolutely key.
So just to not monopolize the Q&A, my final question is about defining objectives. That's something that so not only having, evaluating what works or doesn't work, but having a clear idea of what we want to achieve. Because I see that in the real world, very often people are not thinking about what for interventions are being done. There is a sense there's a problem and something has to be done. So then how do you integrate this into your framework of evidence-based conservation?
Yeah, it is. Traditionally, conservation was done with a purpose. We want to set up this, we want to create this reed bed to attract breeding bitterns, or, we want to restore this grassland for these orchids. That's kind of how that works. There's increasing interest in ideas of wilding or rewilding, or whatever you want to call it, where you don't necessarily really know where it's going to go, and sometimes it can go in unexpected directions. And that then, I think, it's exciting, but has challenges. Some of those rewilding, I'm sure, is going to go in directions that are quite obviously pretty disastrous, and, it doesn't produce anything that's at all attractive. But if you view somewhere like Knepp, which is a rewilding site in the United Kingdom, it has been hugely successful in ways that nobody would have predicted. There's a very rare butterfly called the purple emperor, and everybody knows it likes these old oak woodlands with some sallows underneath, and it's very rare. At Knepp, there's lots of young sallows, and I think before I'd seen a couple of them in my life. I saw 80 in the air at once, or 80 in a day. There was just, there are hordes of them, there are vast numbers of them, because we got the ecology, we didn't know what was expected. And there's a whole range of other things that have happened at Knepp by species that haven't read the books. So recreating that habitat and seeing what happens is also kind of quite interesting. And I think that provides a challenge. And I think a lot depends on the scale of what you're doing. I think a lot of conservation does have a target. I'm creating this bat hibernaculum for bats. I'm planting these mangroves in order to get more mangroves. Those have clear outcomes. Some of the broad habitat measures are less clear-cut. But it's a complicated issue.
To the audience. It is. And I would say that also we had to be conscious with our interventions, because we deal with complex systems, and the amount of unexpected outcomes are always very high. So we need to be very careful sometimes. So just let me just read the question from the audience. We have a question from Alison Wee from the University of Nottingham in Malaysia. Thanks, Bill, from the insightful talk. I am a keen supporter of collecting conservation evidence, and I use the conservation evidence website for teaching every year. My question is, it is great to be able to do meta-analysis on conservation evidence and understand what works best. However, conservation is also highly context-specific. Something that works in one place might not work in another. How do we reconcile this, or how best to use the conservation evidence?
I think that is the cutting edge of evidence use at the moment. So medicine, I've been very influenced by evidence-based medicine. I know it's wonderful, but also I think it also complicates things, because in medicine, crudely, you can kind of imagine it's all the same, and medics shout at me when I say that. But if you imagine a treatment in surgery, then the kind of surgeons' places are kind of more or less the same around the world. Or for lots of standard drugs, what's the effectiveness of treatments for malaria? And I accept that there are some cases the social conditions matter. In conservation, the the site is often very important. And again, you can imagine a spectrum on invasive plants. The way in which you spray a plant and it dies is probably consistent around the world. If you imagine social interventions, then they're probably hugely context specific. And I think what we need to do is we need to think more about that. And I described that cube, that evidence cube, and there were three axes. The study quality, as I described with the work of Alex, we're going quite a long way to think about what study quality means. The two other axes, one is bias. So how biased are these different studies? So which ones are objective and which ones are less objective? That's a really difficult one. And then the relevance. The way we do this at the moment is we ask individuals to work out the relevance themselves. So you would look at a set of studies and you'd say, well, I'm in China, and this is one from also in China, so it's highly relevant. This is one from somewhere nearby, so that's pretty relevant. Here's one from the United Kingdom, and that's much less relevant. So doing that themselves and creating the weighting themselves. But really, we need ways of automating that more and saying, when does it matter? What things matter? And it's kind of a big open area. And I think that's true across the board. Medicine hasn't solved that yet. We're thinking hard about that.
We have a question from Jun Yang. Dear Professor Sutherland, thank you for your excellent talk. Evidence means things happened in the past. However, decision makers must deal with the future. Things may be different in the future. There is high uncertainty. To use past evidence to guide future policies, how to resolve this conflict. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, and I'm delighted, and thanks both of you for using evidence. I'm very pleased by that. So we've done a piece of work where we looked at, in fact, we wrote a book, another open access book, where we looked at seabirds in the North Atlantic. And we've looked at the likely consequences of climate change on each of those seabirds, and then said which ones of these are likely to have the most serious problems, and worked with experts to assess that. And then we said, what are the different things that could be done in order to change that? So if the threat is warming on islands, what could be done? If it's a spread of predators, what could be done? If it's a decline in fish stocks, what could be done? So you can go some way towards thinking how you could use existing evidence. But I think also what we need to do is we need to find ways of thinking, what would the actual consequences of future changes be? And how can we then study that? So if the studies are the effects of warming, how can we look at the effects of leaving the grass so it's warmer, or creating more heterogeneity so they're more north-facing slopes? These sorts of things. How can we think of measures that would directly deal with those impacts and create experiments in order to work out what to do in the future? I think that's a big open area, and there's some research on it, but not enough.
Yeah, I will add that for many years I have been teaching evidence-based conservation together with adaptive management as two things that are highly complementary. In that I'm surprised how many people haven't been exposed to things like adaptive management. You know that every year I find that most of my students, graduate students, they are not familiar with this concept, with how to apply it. So it's surprising. We have interesting questions.
We do need to make sure that this is embedded in all undergraduate courses and all postgraduate courses. In the same way as if someone was trained as a medic and they didn't know how to assess evidence, they would be a terrible medic. And yet we produce conservationists who know quite a lot of different bits of theory, but don't know how to look up and assess the evidence. So they don't know how to do their job.
Yeah, I remember reading about the amount of errors done daily by general practitioners, general doctors. And it was there was one study in the US was about 8 errors per doctor per day in terms of simple diagnosis. So then I guess it will be very, depends when you do the study and many things. But the thing is, it was not a trivial amount. The amount of mistakes of simple things that was because the doctor didn't go to the textbook to refresh what probably that person knows. I mean, it's not lack of knowledge. It's making a decision without your checklist and without the right process to make decisions. So then, yeah, it is. And these things, as you showed, it saved many lives. It can improve a lot the use of resources and can have very, very good impact for conservation. So talking about the students, we have one.
Oh, can I jump in there? So we've
Sure.
Jessica Walsh has done the same experiment looking at conservation, and there we had the bird synopsis, which is our collation of evidence, and we had a time when that work had been completed but hadn't been published. So there was this sort of secret database of what works. And she brought together a group of, I think, 118 practitioners who were protecting birds that were eaten by predators. And their job was to reduce the predation of their birds that they're protecting. And she then spoke to those experts and asked what actions they'd heard of. There's a list of about 30 possible actions, and that they'd heard of about 60% on average. So the way we view that is it's sort of like having blinkers, that you can only see this subset. And really what you want to do for any decision is you want to say, what's the wide range of possible options? There's some that are mad and some that are politically impossible and financially impossible, but you start with that long list and then shorten that down to things that you might be interested in thinking about, and then look at the evidence and then decide what to do. And the other thing she then did was she then said, if you then look at this evidence and then see whether or not you would then do something different as a result of seeing this evidence. And on 42% of the occasions, they said that they would. And this isn't secret evidence. This is a secret collation, but the evidence is already sitting there. The evidence is already in the literature, but that they were unaware of it. And when they're made aware of it, they would regularly change what they said they would do. So that shows that almost certainly the lack of access to information means that people are doing the wrong things.
Well, I think we live in a time in which access to information is very different to what it was 30 years ago, 50 years ago. So now we need to be able to discriminate properly, the quality of the information, the value of the information. We have a question from a high school student.
Excellent.
As a high school, and I don't know where this person comes from. As a high school student, I wonder how can we build our ability to effectively analyze evidence and make decisions based on that. Speaking of evidence and decisions generally, usually because of time constraints, we may skip the evidence research process or do it in a hasty way. So sometimes I feel somehow confused about if I should invest so much time into this process.
Oh, yeah. I've heard very many well-known professors ask the same question. So I'm deeply impressed by this high school teacher, and I'm sure you'll go far. I think part of it, so the way it used to be is that evidence was really difficult to look up and find. And what we've been doing is trying to make evidence really accessible. So I have conservation evidence you can look up in your phone in minutes. And so if you then have a problem, you can look it up almost instantaneously. And if that's the case, then it's really a question about interpreting that evidence. And it's not that the access to the evidence is difficult. It's that you can now look it up, and we now increasingly want to provide the training so people can make sense of the evidence and decide what to do. And for us, the barrier is that people just don't look at the evidence, and it's not an important thing to do. If you're a doctor and you don't look at the evidence and your patient is in problems, then you yourself get into lots of problems. If a conservation biologist and you do something that isn't supported by the evidence and it doesn't go well, nobody asks any questions. So I think let's make it easy to do, but also create a society where you just look at the evidence. And so high school student, I wish you well, and I'm very impressed by your question.
Yeah, very, very impressed. The question and the expression as well, very articulate, very well done. So I have a small follow-up on that. One of my concerns in this area is that those who produce evidence, who tend to be researchers, scientists, we are under very high pressure to produce novelty, new things with high impact, published in high impact journals. So then there is almost no incentive, no reward, even there is a punishment to doing case studies, local case studies, things that have been done before. So then at the end, what we're doing is we are kind of crowding out the replication of studies. So then how do you see that we could improve that to create a mechanism to reward what is most important for conservation to build up this evidence?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think it's a serious problem. And I think also just the creation, the testing of different ways of treating with an invasive plant is a useful thing to do, but will not make you an internationally famous scientist. And I think that means that very often we want to be ensuring that work is largely done by practitioners. And that's the way to do it, I think. And for practitioners to say, well, there's only one, we're basing this on one study, which is somewhere else. Surely we want another study that's particularly in our country in order to see whether or not this is likely to be effective. So, and making it so that it's easy. And also we've been working with funders to find ways in which funders can encourage the creation of evidence. And they can provide the money in order to do that. And they're very interested in doing that. They don't want to pay for huge scientific projects, but they're very happy to find ways of spending a few percentage of their money on ensuring that we're learning.
We have one question from Musa. He's from XTBG. Thank you, Professor William Sutherland, for an educative conservation webinar. It's a great idea to have come up with a YouTube channel, because YouTube has become somewhat a convenient learning platform with very useful learning resources. Hardcover books are mostly difficult to access and most often not updated or in tune with modern trends in science. I guess, what do you think?
Indeed. So I've been really interested for a long time in sort of open access. So we produced a book in 2000, the Conservation Handbook. That's where I first talked about evidence-based conservation. That's where the term evidence-based conservation was invented. And then I discovered that the cost of publishing the book was about the same as my royalties. So instead of royalties, I was paid in free books. And then the Natural History Book Service kindly offered to post it out. So we sent out sort of 3,000 copies to people outside Western Europe and America. And that was brilliant. That was great getting that information out. And since then, and we did that we set up the gratis book scheme. We've done that for other books too. And we made our other books open access. So that's the way forward. But I think you're right that books are great, but it's not actually what people look at. People want to look at online material, and people largely go to YouTube and Bilibili, I think you talk about, and other sources in order to get that information. And so if we're going to be relevant, I think I kind of got to move with the times, which is amuses my daughters that I've got a YouTube channel. But I think that's, you've got to say, where will people get their information from, and how can we ensure that there's good quality information there? Because there's quite a lot of bad quality information out there as well.
Yeah. I hope that we continue reading, because I think reading is a particular way of, absorbing information. The pace, the focus, the time it takes is not the same. Watching a video, the amount of concentration, the amount of mental effort is not the same. So I think what we learn by reading a book, I think, is that we don't forget. I mean, I would like to think that one book gives you one key idea you will remember forever, and I think every book that you read for real, it kind of adds something. But I guess a 2-minute video can give you an open door to an idea, to a concept, but it's not going to be fixated the same way. Maybe that's why I really don't know the evidence of this. So we have
I was reading a book this morning, so I agree.
So then one question from Xiaoyu. Yu Xiaoyu is a PhD student. Thank you for your talk. I noticed that in 2016, artificial intelligence was placed as a horizon issue. Can you talk about the potential and risk of AI for conservation? And since horizon scans of global conservation issues have been run for so many years, are there still challenges or limitations of this method?
So the world is going to change completely with AI, and including things like social media and the internet, that AI generated material, and particularly, you can generate AI material instantaneously, and you can create multiple copies of that, so that search engines and have them out in different ways, and found out the way that search engines will find different ones. So it might be that the literature is swamped with artificial material, and that you don't know what's true or not. So is this really me, or am I AI created that's answering these questions? Once that becomes hard to tell, then we're on very peculiar ground. I suspect we'll find solutions to that, but there are a whole range of, and which jobs are under threat and all those sorts of things. So the world is going to change enormously. But there are exciting sides, and we've been collating the evidence using AI and putting that in a sort of galaxy of the literature by creating a huge number of papers, and then putting that so you can see this sort of universe where you click on a planet, and that's a particular paper, and you can visualize these, and you can visualize how they're clustered together. All of that stuff is incredibly exciting. So that is the way forward. So the collation of evidence, we believe, will largely be done by AI in the future, with humans helping, but we hope it's going to be made massively more efficient.
Yeah. And we have a question from Professor Akihiro Nakamura from XTVG. Thank you for your wonderful talk. How do you deal with the increasing number of people who love to listen to what they want to listen instead of evidence-based information? When people are sick, they listen to doctors as their lives are threatened. When it comes to conservation, people don't often listen to conservation practitioners, perhaps because they are not directly threatened, or we are not qualified like medics.
I think there's a number of elements. I think we need to make conservation more professional. A lot of it, I think, is very amateur, and we've been looking at sort of performance measures and things like that. How do you work out who's doing things well or not? So I think we sort of need to find ways of ensuring we do things better. And one of the things we're interested in is the decision-making process. So we're busy here creating a checklist of different actions. And you can then say, so you can fill that in and say, was this decision made in a way that is likely to result in a sensible decision? And part of that is to say, how much effort do you want to make in this decision? So you want to say, is this issue trivial or important? Is this issue obvious or uncertain? And if it's trivial or unimportant, you just sort of kind of do it. If it's important and uncertain, you want to spend some time thinking about the quality of the decision. And we produce this checklist, which you can then imagine politicians filling in, to say, is this a good quality decision? And you could also use that for looking at decisions that others have made and say, what was the decision-making process that they've adopted? And then if we have that sort of approach, we can then start working out when decision-making is good and when it's bad, and whether or not it's acceptable for people to be making bad decisions.
Okay, I think we don't have more questions online. So then, unless something pops up right now as I wrap up, otherwise I think we'll come to an end of this webinar. So then, Bill, yeah, we had, as mentioned before, around 2,000 people watching. I want to say thank you because your work, I think, is really important. I think is work that matters for conservation and has been very inspiring. And, you know, as you were presenting, I was remembering the many papers that I read in the last 20 years that it really clicked when I was reading that were very influential. And yeah, I think if you want, we can follow up discussion outside of the webinar about Bilibili and other things that could be useful to reach to more people. So to the audience, thank you very much for joining today. Our next webinar is scheduled for 4th of July, I think it is, and 3rd of July, but it's the first Tuesday of July. But there might be some change on the date we are discussing with the speaker right now. It will be Rodrigo Medellin from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM. And see you next month again. If you have conservation content to publish, consider Integrative Conservation. If you want to guest edit a special collection, contact us. We are very, very much welcoming new ideas. So thank you very much. And let's stay online and let's have a brief discussion, Bill, if that's okay with you.
Great. And thanks everyone for those interesting questions. And thanks to the 2,000 people for listening. I'm amazed. Thank you very much.